Good evening, everybody. We'll call the Wednesday, May 9th, 2018 Capital Improvements Advisory Committee meeting to order. First item on our agenda is a public hearing. Hold a public hearing, consider and file the semi-annual report for the October 1st, 2017 through March 31st, 2018, evaluating the progress of the city on achieving the capital improvements program and identifying any problems in implementing the plans or administering the capital recovery fees.
All right. Good evening. My name is James Walters. I'm with the City of Schertz Finance Department. Today we'll review the first half of the 2017-18 fiscal year capital impact fee expense and revenue report. Going for the first page real quick on the allocated fund balances. So this is the amounts that we've already allocated directly to projects from our impact fees. The water had $2.7 million in there. Sewer currently has zero allocated dollars. The net change was $6,248. Those were engineering fees for the Corbett elevated water tower. Under the unallocated impact fee balance, so we started with $4.9 million and $5.6 million in the water and sewer impact fees, respectively. Revenue fees collected for water was about $836,000 for the first 6 months of this quarter, or for this year, and $470,000 under the sewer for this year. Investment income is doing better than we've seen in many years. So about $35,000 in the first 6 months, and then $24,000 respectively. You will see we had the auditor and accounting costs come through during this quarter, or during this. We usually do quarters. I apologize. During this first half of the year, so that's through the $1,000 per fund, and the sewer also has an investment management fee. Ending fund balance of the unallocated portion, so water went from 4.9 to 5.8, sewer went from 5.6 to just over $6 million. Last time we made an update to the report, so we also included, and as a bottom, as a reminder of the estimated cost of the current unfunded projects. So once these projects become funded and get allocated, funds would come out of unallocated impact fee balance and go into the allocated fee balance sections. So projects identified in the plans in the CIP but currently have not begun work or been funded directly include the Corbett ground storage tank, the Northeast Quad distribution mains, the next impact fee study update, the Crossvines batch plant expansion just went to council for a couple of budget adjustments, so you will see that project become funded in the next report. So we're about to start moving on that project. That should be wrapped up and completed by the end of the fiscal year. Bullman-Haring trunk line, we are working on engineering costs continue to go on that one. So while that is funded, it was funded first through a bond. So the first $3 million came out of debt service, and then the last estimate we had for the money that we think is going to come out of the impact fees was 2.9. The next item identified was the Cibolo West trunk line, about $6 million, and then their impact fee study update, about $250,000. So if we tried to fund all of these right now, the water fund would be about $700,000 short, and the sewer would be $3.5 million short. As we go forward with these projects and we need them, if we haven't collected the funds by then, those balances will be made up from other sources like water and sewer operating revenue or through a debt issuance to cover the rest of the costs. We also added 2 new pages to the report, including a breakdown of each of the projects listed in the CIP, as well as when the funding happened in this first box, when we actually allocated the funding, and where it was funded from. And then you will see each of the expenses per the 6 months as required on the front page of the report, broken down by reporting period. So you see on the Corbett elevated tank, we had the $6,248. That's what was reported on the front page. Total expense on the project to date is $292,000, and the project balance, they still have $2.7 million left for construction. Under the sewer side, just a reminder, the Town Creek Phase 3 was identified in the capital impact fee. report, and that project is completed. Under the Woman Hollering trunk line, so the big line that's going to go to the new treatment facility in the southern area of Schertz, while it wasn't reported on the front page that any expenses had been allocated for the project, that was because there were no current impact fees assigned to the project. The project itself was funded $3 million from a bond, and they did have expenses of $247,000 in engineering fees during this quarter. None of that came out of impact fees yet, but once construction starts, they will need to use the impact fee balance for construction. Left on the bond to date is about $2.2 million. Total expenses is $756,000 for that project to date. Does anybody have any questions over the report or any of the projects currently underway?
Okay, first of all, this is a public hearing, so let's go ahead and conduct that. Public hearing open at 6:06. If anyone in the audience has any comments or questions regarding the capital projects reports? Anyone? All right, seeing none, then we'll close the public hearing at 6:07. Commissioners?
Oh, I'd also like to point out one change since the last report. The previous estimate on the Crossvine Bash Plant expansion was closer to $300,000. We got new estimates back from CCMA, and we took those with a higher amount, and we took those budget adjustments to council in the past 2 months. So that's where you actually see a new amount under that project for anticipated actual. So, sorry, I didn't mention that during the previous.
I have a question. On the impact fee study update, is that just a budget hold, or do you expect to pay $500,000 for that update? That's to write a new impact fee report or CIP? What is it?
Yeah, that's for the new impact fee report and CIP review, much like the street impact fee study.
$500,000?
Yes.
Hmm? And I know what the Woman Hollering trunk line is. What's the Cibolo West trunk line?
So the actual impact fee project list actually listed 2 trunk lines. So there's a second trunk line that would go into the new sewer station, and it would go, well, the current one mirrors more towards 1518. The Cibolo West, I believe, is on the other side, moving back towards the 1103 area, or 3009.
Good evening. So the Cibolo West line actually runs close to the Cibolo Creek and picks up the sewer shed that is to the east of the Woman Hollering sewer shed. There's actually a Cibolo East line associated with what'll feed the plant, but that's actually in Cibolo. So the Cibolo West means it's on the west side of the Cibolo Creek.
Thank you.
On the Woman Hollering trunk line, we're showing an estimated cost of $10.8 million. We've done $3 million worth of bonds, and we're showing the estimated cost of unfunded projects on the Woman Hollering trunk line at $2.9 million. There's still about $5 million difference there. So where's that source of funding going to be?
You are correct. That should be that. $2.9 was an old estimate and did not get updated on the front page. So that should be closer to 7 million on the front page.
So basically, we're still unfunded by approximately $7 million on that.
We believe so. We'll know for sure once the engineering study is done and design. If the motion can state that we, to approve, if the report's approved, we can change that front number to the correct balance. And if we make that in the motion, we can take that to council with a corrected report.
But it's that number and the total below it are all have to be changed, correct?
Yes, both. So that's a sum.
So the unfunded projects aren't 3.5 million in the hole, they're 10 million in the hole, correct?
It'd be closer to 8, yeah, 8.5, yeah.
I guess just a quick question on the front page of the general information portion of your packet. One of the questions there where it says to file semi-annual reports with respect to the progress of the capital improvements plan and report to City Council any perceived inequities in implementing the plan. Just on general knowledge, you know, what would you consider perceived inequities and how would we look for them?
The inequities would be expenses not related to the impact fee project list, or if there was a grave miscalculation of the numbers. So if we had way too much money, that would also be reported. I think that would be something you would raise to council.
Mr. Chairman, I kind of leave it up to the rest of the committee because I don't want to waste our capital improvements membership only, but I have a little difficulty approving a report that's not showing the accurate numbers.
And I'll have to agree with Mr. Outlaw on that. I think it should be updated and the right numbers reflected before we
Sure. Yeah, we
take
can
action on it.
bring it back at the next meeting with a corrected report.
Unless there's some time aspect that we're missing out on here.
I think we'll be okay.
So for the commission then, it seems like we're kind of leaning toward tabling this until we get the corrected information. So if that's the
Yeah.
direction we're going to go, then I'd like to have a motion.
Well, Mr. Chairman, first, you do still need to open and close your public hearing since it was posted as a public hearing. So.
We did that at 6:06 and 6:07, yes.
It was that quick that I missed it.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Maybe the hat was on a little too tight. All right, so a motion from anyone?
Mr.
Motion.
Chairman, I'll go ahead and make that motion that we table the first half of the fiscal year capital improvements impact fee report until such time as staff can make the necessary corrections and bring it back to us.
I'll second that.
Motion by Commissioner Outlaw and a second by Mr. Brown. Any other comments or questions?
Question, did not the city council approve money for the second woman hollering sewer plant, the temporary plant?
Temporary plant, yes.
But it's not on here either.
The Crossvines batch plant.
Yeah, the Crossvines Bash Plant expansion, that 487,000 of the unfunded project is the new estimate that just went to council last week. So it was outside the scope of this report.
Okay, that's what I was going to say. I wasn't sure when it was done, but if it was done this month, of course, it's next quarter.
On the next report, not only will you see that funded, but it'll probably also be spent.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right, any other questions? All right, we have a motion and a second to table for staff to bring back with the corrected information. Call for a vote.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye, motion carries. All right, and with that, we will adjourn at 6:15 on the capital improvements. And we will call to order at 6:16 the regular Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. Next item on the agenda is hearing of residents. Do have one person signed up, John Sullivan.
Good evening, Commissioners. 513 Triple Crown. I just wanted to come up here, and it's National Bicycle Month, so wanted to come up here and say a few words. I like to go on a bike ride a lot, but I also like to eat, and I go to a lot of restaurants. And one thing I run into a lot is just where do I park my bike and lock it up. There's this one restaurant I've gone to a few times. I have to like park. I have a bike trailer sometimes too, and I have to park in the walkway and lock up where people are walking in and out the door just to be able to lock up the bike. So it's become a problem. I've tried to figure out why so many places don't have bike racks. And I've talked to businesses, and they really don't have any opposition to it. They actually wish they had thought of it. But it seems to me like it's a problem after the fact to try and go and find space to put in a bike rack or something like that. So it seems like it's just an awareness issue. And so I just want to promote maybe looking at putting this in the UDC in some way, just having a bike rack parking or some kind of bicycle parking, especially with the new businesses coming in. It's like the entertainment center up on 35 and that kind of thing. It's going to be popular for, I think, teenagers. And I mean, I know I will be there on my bike a lot. So it could be an issue if there's not any parking, and it's unsightly maybe for people coming to the community and that kind of thing, but it's more of like a safety and security for the people riding their bike. But other than that, overall, I mean, it'd be good for the residents. I think it helps to promote transportation alternatives, people riding their bike instead of getting on the road and causing traffic issues, and I really don't think businesses it's not a huge cost, and I think it actually helps businesses raise awareness for the issue. So, thank you.
Anyone else have any comments for the commission? All right. Next item on the agenda then will be consent agenda, minutes for the March 28th, 2018, and the April 25th, 2018 regular meeting. Commissioners, do we need to pull for individual consideration, or can we consider them together?
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion that we approve both items on the consent agenda.
Okay, I have a motion by Commissioner Outlaw. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Second by Commissioner Greenwald. Any other comments, questions? All right, we'll call for a vote.
Aye.
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 Aye. Motion carries 7-0. All right, next item on the agenda, public hearings. Item A, PC 2016-067. Hold a public hearing, consider and act upon a request for approval of a replat of the Lot 1, Block 1 of the Cowstone subdivision and the adjacent unplatted property. The property consists of approximately 5 acres of land and is located at 3581 FM 3009 and 3701 FM 3009, City of Schertz, Guadalupe County, Texas. Emily.
Good evening, Commissioners. So the subject property in question tonight is roughly 5 acres, and just want to get your bearings. So this is 3009, Ashley Oak, and Savannah, and the subject property is outlined here in green. You may remember that this property was rezoned to neighborhood services in January of 2017. And the current proposal is to develop into 2 lots to do a medical office on each lot. So since the property was rezoned from residential to commercial within the last 5 years, Texas Local Government Code requires that we send written notice to all the original property owners within the original subdivision and also publish in the newspaper of record. So we did publish in the San Antonio Express News on April 20th, and the original subdivision consisted of 2 lots. It's kind of hard to see, but in this inlay corner here, the one lot that's being replatted tonight, Lot 1, and then there was one other lot, Lot 2, in the back here. Both of those property owners received, we sent mailers to them on April 19th, and we have not received a response back. The property is serviced by Schertz Water, CCMA, GVEC, AT&T, Spectrum, and CenterPoint Energy. So I wanted to do kind of a zoomed in on the plat exhibit just to be able to show you all the lots a little easier. So Lot 4 is the larger lot. It's 3.770 acres and is outlined here in blue. And then Lot 3 is the smaller lot. It's 1.656 acres, shown in here as the red. Since the property is adjacent to 3009, TxDOT reviewed the access and drainage and did supply a letter of no objection. Their one qualifier was that Lot 4 was going to be allowed an access to 3009 while Lot 3 was not. So they do have to share this one access point. They are providing a 25-foot ingress-egress easement through Lot 4 into Lot 3, which identified as this yellow line here. So as y'all know, probably most likely, sidewalks along this property line are already established. They will remain with the development of the 2 lots. A drainage plan was reviewed and approved by the city engineer. The applicant submitted a tree affidavit that no trees would be harmed or destroyed with the replat. However, with the development of the 2 lots, that tree affidavit and the tree survey will be reviewed again for any mitigation that's due. Currently, 3009 is 120-foot right-of-way, so no dedication is required or proposed with the plat. The proposed replat is consistent with all of the applicable requirements for the property ordinances and regulations, and staff is making a recommendation of approval, and we do have representatives of the project here, in case there's any questions.
Okay, and this is a public hearing, so we open the public hearing at 6:23. Does anyone wish to make any comments? All right, seeing none, we'll close the hearing at 6:24. All right, commissioners.
Is Green Valley Road going to be carried through?
No, sir.
Okay.
So this is, so I probably should have clarified this a little more. The existing Lot 2 of Calstone, which is not included as part of this replat, does have property that goes up to this point. So they have access off of 3009 through here. And then obviously, as I said, TxDOT only granted the one access point into Lot 4.
I need some help understanding, looking at the diagrams, looking at this plat that you have up here. When you up in the upper left-hand corner, which is an area to be replatted, it shows Block 1 as being that flag lot in the back.
Yes, so this is Lot 1, Block 1.
Okay.
That is the property that's being replatted with the adjacent unplatted property.
Okay, so that's because I'm seeing that line come all the way down. I thought that was another lot in front of it, but that's actually part of.
It's part of the new proposed Lot 3.
Okay. And maybe you can understand where that's confusing. The other thing I wanted to verify, I looked in the UDC, and the only reference I could find requiring the 2 ingress and egress points was on residential. Is that correct? That's not applicable to commercial development?
That is correct. And also with it being TxDOT, we're kind of limited if TxDOT only grants the 1 access point.
Well, I understand that, but in that case, it would require whatever you want to call it, a variance or however you want to address it.
If it was residential, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I understand what TxDOT's trying to not have another Pat Booker Road where every 20 feet you've got a driveway.
Yep.
But I'm sorry, folks, I understand that's a state highway, but we're talking about city of Schertz, and we're talking about our planning process, and we're talking about our development, okay? And between you and me, I'm getting sick and tired of TxDOT telling me what I can and can't do in this kind of thing. If I've got a safety requirement that says I have to have 2 points of access, then I don't see where it's their position to step up and say, well, you can't have them 400 feet. I'm sorry. And whoever's the next one to talk to that bunch, maybe you can pass on my displeasure with that. I understand you're between a rock and a hard place, okay? But I hope you can understand where I'm coming from as well. All right.
Questions on the house? There's still a residential house on Lot 2,
Correct.
but when we changed the zoning, we changed the zoning for this whole.
We did not change the zoning for Lot 2, Block 1. We just changed the zoning for Lot 1 and then the adjacent unplatted property in front and adjacent to it.
So it's still residential.
Correct. So with the development of the lots, they will be required to do all of the buffering and screening and the masonry wall and all of that adjacent to the residential.
So there's going to have to be the masonry wall on the south border of that property.
So the masonry
along that driveway.
Yes, so the masonry wall will have to go, kind of follow my cursor, if you will. Since this is all adjacent residential properties as well, it'll have to go down this property line, up, down, and all the way down. And they'll stop the masonry wall at a point where it doesn't impede visibility for Lot 2 to access the roadway.
And that's because that's a residential driveway, even though on the other side of that is commercial property, you're going to make them put an 8-foot masonry wall along that driveway?
So our code says residentially zoned or used.
Just so they can tear it down when Lot 2 finally decides they want to get their money and we do some commercial development there, so they can pay to put this wall up just to tear it down later. I'm sorry. I thought we were getting some common sense going here, but I'm beginning to wonder again.
Build it slowly.
I understand the need to screen residential property from a commercial property, but I don't understand why we have to screen somebody's driveway from a piece of commercial property. It just,
I'm wondering the same thing as Mr. Outlaw, because it looks like in the future, we're setting aside an access easement on the yellow border to access Lot 2 at some time in the future. It just seems to be, and I don't know what the plans are for Lot 2. I don't know how long the people that live there plan on staying there, or what the future holds for that lot. But it just seems to be a waste to build a masonry wall along that driveway when at some point, probably the near future, you can probably, we'll probably replat it to take that access away and then make the access through lot 4.
So I would just remind the commission that what's before you is a plat.
I know,
So that's what we need to focus on.
I know. But it all goes to the discussion about whether or not I want to raise an issue about building a masonry wall back there.
But the masonry wall is not part of the plat. We're just trying to replat the property into 2 commercial lots, regardless of if they have to build the masonry wall or not.
Yeah, that's all done as site plan, which
Correct.
this commission has no control over, so.
All right, any other questions? All right, looking for a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion that we approve the replat of the Calstone subdivision, PC 2016-067.
All right, have a motion by Commissioner Outlaw. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Second by Ms.
Mr. Ray.
All right, Mr. Bro. All right, so we have a motion and a second to approve. Commissioners, any comments, questions?
I'm sorry, sir, who was the second?
Commissioner Bro.
Thank you.
All right, we'll call for a vote.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Nay.
Aye. Motion carries 6-1. Next item on the agenda, item ZC 2018-002, hold a public hearing, consider and make a recommendation to City Council on an amendment of Part 3, Schertz Code of Ordinances, Unified Development Code, UDC, to subsections in Articles 9 and 16 to amend certain site design standards for public water and wastewater facilities. Chenery.
Good evening, Commissioners. At the last Planning and Zoning Commission meeting, staff had presented to your commission a proposal to modify, to amend various UDC sections to allow for some exemptions for public water and wastewater facilities. This bulleted list identifies all the sections that are proposed to be amended to exempt public water and wastewater facilities from certain site design standards. And at the last meeting, your commission tabled it so that staff could look at Unified Development Code Section 21.15.4, which is regarding utilities, so that we could look at whether or not there would be an ability to incorporate into our proposed amendments an amendment to the section to address utility poles. And in staff's evaluation of that code section, we felt that because of the way the code section is written, any proposed amendment to that would essentially be amendments that we should look at holistically rather than looking at it simply focused on public water and wastewater facilities. And so for that reason, we are proposing to proceed with the proposed amendments that are specific to public water and wastewater facilities, and then bring forward to your commission at a separate time proposed amendments to the code section 21.15.4 to address utility poles, and whether or not we would incorporate modified waiver criteria or any modifications to allow for wooden poles as opposed to the current requirement that it all be metal poles, unless it's a waiver that is approved by the city manager or his or her designee. So what we wanted to do for tonight was to present to you some exhibits, because at the last meeting we also heard your commission express some comments indicating that it would be helpful to see some exhibits to see how certain facilities would be.
Hold up just a minute.
Yes, sir.
Before we go any further in the discussion of this item, we need to untable it.
And you're,
I'm sorry.
That's true, yeah, it is.
It's tabled.
It's tabled,
It
yep.
needs to be untabled, ladies and gentlemen,
True.
to complete any further discussion.
All right, so yes, we need to have a motion to pull this off the table and open it for consideration.
Mr. Chair, make a motion, we untable ZC 2018-002
All right,
for further consideration.
and do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Outlaw. All right, call for a vote.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, 7-0. Thank you for that, Mr. Evans. All right, sorry, Channery,
No
please continue.
problem. I apologize for jumping into my presentation so quickly. Okay, so this bulleted list identifies all the proposed changes, and then at the last meeting, your commission had indicated that it would be helpful to look at some visuals to see how the current UDC code requirements would affect pretty much how these facilities would be built. And so what staff has done is we pulled 3 different locations, 3 different facilities, and you'll see, I'll go through each of those with an aerial and then a street view, and we'll have a discussion about how the UDC code requirements would affect the built environment for each of these facilities. So this is an exhibit that shows all of the locations of facilities within Schertz. Currently we have 7 storage tank sites and 18 lift stations. And based on input from engineering, it sounds like we may add 2 to 3 more tank sites and possibly a couple more lift stations. But the exact number of that is undetermined at this point because it's dependent on development patterns. There are 3 treatment plant sites, the OJR site, which is CCMA site, the GBRA site, and the woman hollering package plant, which will be abandoned after the new CCMA South Schertz plant is online. And no additional treatment plants are anticipated at this time. So this is an existing tower off Live Oak Road. And these measurements are approximations using the measuring tool off Google Earth. As you can see, it's adjacent to some residential. It is about 710 feet deep, and there's an off of Live Oak Road. This is Live Oak Road here at the very bottom of the exhibit, of the picture. There's a driveway that leads all the way to the back of the facility, and it's approximately 15 feet wide. Now, if we were to look at this facility under the current UDC standards, which require some landscaping adjacent to residential, the built environment for this would be significantly different. The 15-foot roadway there would be bumped further in from the adjacent residential lots. There's 3 adjacent residential lots here that abut the westerly side of the project site. And the requirement would be a 20-foot landscape buffer, and within that landscape buffer, there would have to be trees planted. In addition to the landscape buffer, there would also be a masonry wall that would be required. Here's the street view. And I believe the fence there, is that a fence-crete? Okay, so there's fence-crete there, but as you can see, the driveway is immediately adjacent to it, and there's no landscape buffer, and hence no landscape, no trees or shrubs planted there. Along the back portion, and I don't have the measurement there, I apologize for that, but that's also residential along the rear portion there. That would also have to incorporate the masonry wall and the landscape buffer with the trees and screening. So as you can see, the size of the site, if we were to plan for it incorporating the current UDC requirements, it would have to be a larger site. Or each of the features would have to be relocated in such a way to accommodate the landscape buffer area. The second station that we wanted to identify was one right off of IH-35 in northern Schertz, and it's off IH-35 frontage. It's adjacent to the North Cliff, Scenic Hills, Fairway Ridge subdivisions, and as you're driving off IH-35, the last street that ties into frontage road before you approach Homestead is right here, and that's Covers Cove. And this project site, there's a station right off of frontage road there, and it's immediately adjacent to a residential lot. And as you can see here, it's about 85 feet away, and within the boundaries of the station, it's 25 feet. So as you can see, the facility itself, within the boundaries of the fencing or the screen wall, it's pretty narrow. And again, if we were to incorporate the landscape buffering requirements and the planting, the site would be larger and it wouldn't be able to be reduced in footprint there. Here's a view of it from frontage road. And the third site we wanted to show to your commission is the tank off of Country Club Boulevard. And this is as you drive in through the North Cliff community, further back in off of Country Club Boulevard, as you're approaching Scenic, I think it's Scenic Hills subdivision. There's a tank that's there, and it's a triangular parcel or lot, and it's completely surrounded by a wall. And as you can notice here with the dimensions depicted, the tank is about 10 feet from this back portion here. It's about 15 feet from the portion immediately adjacent to Scenic Links here. Country Club Boulevard turns into Scenic Links Drive. And again, if we were to incorporate the landscape buffering requirements and also planting of trees, it would affect this built environment as well. The screening is entirely opaque, for all three it was entirely opaque, but the current code requirement, depending on how you look at the orientation of the front yard and fencing requirements, currently with the UDC, the fencing that exists for each of these facilities would not be able to be opaque as they currently are. Another feature that we wanted to point out is behind this facility there's a drainage portion here, and while that serves as a buffer, it is still immediately adjacent to residential, and so that landscape buffering requirement would also apply in this scenario. And as I mentioned, the opaque masonry walls that exist for all three facilities, the landscaping requirement that currently exists for the UDC that we're proposing an amendment to exempt public water and wastewater facilities. The reason we're requesting that proposed amendment is because if those shrubs were to be planted and the trees were to be planted, it's slightly different for public water and wastewater facilities, which are usually surrounded by these opaque walls. The purpose of those shrubs and trees, the planting, serves as an aesthetic item for commercial lots. In this case, staff doesn't feel that the need for it applies in the same manner for public water and wastewater facilities. And so we thought we'd just present these pictures to your commission so that you can look at existing sites and see why we are proposing these amendments. Back to the section of the UDC 21.15.4, which talks about utilities, and then that's where the provision regarding utility poles is specified. Staff had looked at when that provision was incorporated into the UDC, and it appears that in 2009, there was a complete overhaul of the UDC, and the utilities section that stipulates that steel poles are required in the event that utilities are placed above ground, that was incorporated in 2009. And at that time, the provision regarding a waiver that could be granted by the city manager was not in place. And the last portion that currently exists in the UDC, which is the provision for the city manager's or his or her designee's ability to grant a waiver when requested, that was incorporated in 2011. And so that's the current language that exists. It has not been modified since then. So the requirement for the metal poles has been around for about 9 years now. And so staff would like to have the additional time to review proposed amendments, see how we could revise that specific section after we have the opportunity to reach out to each of the electricity service providers as well, and then do a full analysis of looking at the pros and cons of steel poles versus wooden poles, and look at potential waiver criteria so that we could see if we can incorporate some objective points for why a waiver or when a waiver could be granted. Oh, so that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
All right, and again, this is a public hearing, so we open the public hearing at 6:47. Does anyone have any comments out in the audience?
I wasn't planning to talk about this, but I was just looking at the pictures, and I just think there's a difference between the pump station and the big facilities, and they are kind of an eyesore, to be honest. And I don't think they're ideal. The Live Oak location probably isn't ideal, and this is not either. So just wanted to throw that out there.
All right, anybody else? All right, close the public hearing at 6:48. Commissioners.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, let me start out by saying something I wanted to say last meeting and I didn't get a chance. I wanted to thank staff for taking this proactive approach rather than typically reacting the way we do. I think that's very positive. However, most of my comments from the last meeting still stand. If I could address, you showed us if you would go back to I have a couple comments on each of the photographs you showed, if you wouldn't mind. Go back to start with that Live Oak. Number one, I think this, while we've certainly done some additions and some improvements not too long ago, I believe this distribution station has been there for a long time. So I'm not sure that it's a good example. But in response, yes, on the one side we have residential property, on the other side we have a church, okay? So it was very convenient, and I think it was basically because that's the way the site was when we started adding to it. The roadway runs down the residential side, but again, I'm seeing we're allowing the city to do things we wouldn't allow a private developer to do. We would never let him put that tank so close to the back corner. There's just I understand some things are the way they are, and that's okay. but those should be considered case by case. You know, again, my primary objection to what you're proposing to do here is a blanket waiver for every public water and wastewater facility, whereas I think we're better off looking at them case by case so that we can stand in front of some builder or developer and say, look, we wanted to do this, but it was physically impossible, and be able to justify why we didn't follow our own standards. You can go to the lift station for me. Now, that entire lot, not just that 25-foot square lift station, that entire lot belongs to the city of Schertz, correct? And so if a developer were to come to us and say, I want to put a building, a 25 by 25-foot building there, we wouldn't be looking at just his building. We'd be looking at that entire lot. We'd make him put a we'd make him put a masonry wall on the edge of that lot. We'd make him put his landscape buffer in there, okay? We don't look at just the one, we look at the entire piece of property that he's developing. Finally, on the storage tank, that's a good example too. I think what we should do is require that opaque fencing around these types of facilities, intentionally to screen them from public view. So rather than, you know, making it an exception, I think it should be a requirement. But now if you go to the street level view of this, the very next one, why couldn't we have planted some shrubs down that side of, I mean, along that wall in that right of way and screened it a little bit rather than just brushing it all off and saying, well, we're the city, we don't need to do that. Again, I like some of the things you've got in here. I think I would be okay with them, but, you know, again, I'm particularly, the whole tree mitigation, just saying, no, you don't have to do it. And the whole idea of we want to have one set of standards for ourselves and one set of standards for somebody else. And, you know, one of the mitigating factors, this is a good example, is a lot of times we as a public entity, we make use of what's left over. You know, this probably, if we were out scouting to buy a piece of property to build this tank, we'd probably never buy this little triangle piece. But, you know, somehow we inherited it, and it is what it is. But again, that's okay, but we should look at this particular case and say yay or nay to waivers rather than just saying you never have to consider this stuff. So, thank you.
Commissioner, I wanted to point out that one of the proposed changes to the fences for, one of the fencing requirements is Section 21.9.8.b is fencing requirements for non-residential uses. And to add to your comment about the opaque screening that we have at these existing facilities, the reason we are proposing to exempt public water and wastewater facilities from the existing code section is in order to allow for this opaque screening that we have here. The proposed amendment is to allow for that because currently the opaque fencing is
Gotcha. No, I understand what you're telling me, but all I'm saying is instead of exempting them and allowing them to use it, you should require them to use it. And I'm sorry, the little brain just clicked on again. How about this wall that runs along here, over here between the public safety facilities and across the back of the fire station? Okay, is that the kind of thing that we would not allow today? Because, you know, and you know, we've got that double gate, that double chain link gate back in this back here corner, and we used to have the slats in it so that, you know, to screen that ugly mess in the back of the fire department from the public. And now I find out we can't do that anymore. You know.
Yes, that's true. The slats are not currently allowed. They're prohibited.
I would agree for the most part, and I do have some concerns about a perception that the city is setting a precedent of discretionary exclusion from the codes, and that we should be demonstrating our commitment to our codes and our standards, if not raising those standards, particularly when it comes to our municipal infrastructure. I think that especially in looking at these, and this helps so much, thank you so much for these images, that we should be integrating our sites into our surroundings and engaging with our surroundings rather than ignoring them. And so I agree. I think that also it should be on a case-by-case basis rather than a blanket change to the codes. But also, when it comes to those fences, one of the reasons why I reached out and expressed my desire to be part of this committee is because I am so tired of seeing these fences. So much as Schertz looks like the maze runner, and I can't decide if they're trying to keep me out or trying to keep me in. And I think that there are so many opportunities to do more landscape buffers than 6 and 8 foot high solid fences. But aside from that, I do agree, and especially when it comes to tree mitigation, I'm extremely passionate about that, and I absolutely think it should be on a case-by-case basis, and that we should not be changing the codes.
Well, just looking at this particular image and Commissioner Outlaw's comments about, landscaping, obviously I guess the current requirement would have us planting shrubs and stuff inside that opaque wall, and maybe we can look at flip-flopping that to where the opaque wall would be set back from the property line, and that there would be some landscaping requirements between the property line and that setback line for the opaque wall. That would make it a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. Some shrubs or something along that fence, because over time, you can see this fence here, it's no longer straight. You got some crooked lines, and looks like it's leaning a little bit in a couple of places. That if there's some shrubbery from that between the property line and that wall, that would make it visually more appealing, but still would maintain the security of the premises, and to focus on shrubs instead of trees, so that way you don't have something that grows up tall enough to where at some point the kids monkeying around at night can climb up in the tree, swing out on the branch, and then drop inside the perimeter. But I'd like to hear some comments from Mr. Greenwald, Mr. Bro.
Okay. Everybody take a seat. This is going to take a little while. Majority of these water tanks were installed, built many, many moons ago, before Schertz owned them. It was part of the water system we supplied to
The Mud District.
Mud District up there at Northcliff. All of these tanks are placed in places where it's elevated. It's a high level. So you're using gravity to feed nighttime and fill them up during the day. If you look, you'll also see there's a bunch of antennas on top of every one of them. Same reason. We want the height. The tank, whatever you want to call it, down by the golf course, doesn't belong to us, belongs to GBRA. And they're fixing to close it out. The problem that's going to create is that was designed to provide treated wastewater for the golf course. I don't know where they're going to get the water now, but it's going to be dumped on the city. They're going to have to find a way to do it. The tank also has the capability for a portion of Northcliff that feeds into that. If we get a heavy rain and stuff, it can be bypassed and pumped to the main tank down here on, at CCMA's plant. But again, it's a manual switch. The tanks, again, like they say, are built normally at a high point somewhere that you get gravity help. That's what it's there for. I know some people don't like them, but I don't know what to tell you. Portion of this is an access point. It's a gate that they can get in and work on the pumps and the valves and stuff. We're going to have leaks. Everybody's got leaks. I don't care where you go. As we build more tanks, more water, more wastewater, we're going to have the same problem. Putting trees and stuff in there. If you've ever seen tree trunk that gets into and breaks into a water line, it gets very expensive to fix. Majority of the time, you don't want trees or anything near it, whether it be a water tank, a sewer tank, septic tank, whatever. You're well aware of that. There are chemicals you actually put in the septic system that kill any roots. Because, again, if you don't, it's going to clog up the system. There's a lot of things that have to be considered, not the least of which is cost. And the cost between a black wooden pole and a metal pole is very, very high. Very high. You want to try and keep prices as reasonable as possible. But that's one thing you want to cut back if you can.
My concern isn't what's planted on the inside of that fencing, it's what's on the outside, and again, how we integrate these sites into the community around it, because that doesn't at all integrate into the community around it. And I think that's one of the things, I'm sorry, is it's the planting that goes on the inside of the fence, is that correct?
Yes, our current requirement is for the landscape buffer to include the trees and shrubs, and that's typically on the interior portion of the subject lot within, so typically there's a wall, and then within the landscape buffer, which is on the interior portion of the lot in relation to the wall, then that's where the planting requirement is. And that's the portion that we're requesting or proposing a UDC amendment to exempt public water and wastewater facilities from that landscape buffer requirement. In the event that there's an 8-foot masonry fence that is proposed with the public water and wastewater facilities.
So the next that's proposed, is that out 15, 18, is that correct?
Yeah, but there's both a water tank and a sewer plant planned for down on 15, off of 1518. Yeah.
Well, there's there's a tank where we have an application right now that we're currently processing, and it's not immediately off of 1518, but it's in Southern Schertz off 1518 beyond where Ray Corbett Drive is going to extend. And then there's a South Schertz plant off of Trainer Hale Road that's currently being proposed, or an application that we're processing right now.
I mean, I agree with you on the idea of eliminating the requirement inside the fence. You know, the question is, you know, like Ms. Bacon was saying, you know, the visual aesthetics and the integration, you know, from the exterior, I think we can do better, you know, that if that 8-foot opaque structure is within whatever number of feet of the property line, that, maybe there should be some screening between the property line and that wall. And then, but if it extends, 100 feet back, as an example, from the property line, that there would be no landscaping requirements, between the property line and the fence, because it's the distance involved. So in a large acreage tract, where if you had 100 acres and you just put the opaque fence around the tanks in the center of the property, you're 300 or 400 feet from your property line, that there'd be no need for additional landscaping requirements.
Well, and this is why I think that it should be on a case-by-case basis. I mean, there's a lot of variables in there.
But then the question comes back, does the UDC, as it's currently written, allow us to make waivers on a case-by-case type basis for this stuff?
Currently, we do not have that in place for the UDC.
Put it in there.
But
Currently evaluating that right now as a potential amendment.
I'll second that.
Well, I'm sorry, I thought one of the reasons you folks took a look at this and we're bringing this forward is that we were having a lot of these things go to the Board of Adjustment. So,
That is correct.
okay, so there is, while the UDC maybe doesn't talk about waivers and variances, there is a method to get around them, correct? And Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to add, to kind of clarify my position, and this picture is a good example. See, I tend to agree, where we screen the facilities like that, requiring us to landscape inside that fence really doesn't make a lot of sense. So, and then when you go back to the Live Oak Tower up here, where I think we're fortunate in that it sits so far back off Live Oak, and you've got that house and those trees that it's effectively screened. And so it makes no sense to, in my mind, to require landscaping in a situation like that. So that's kind of where I was, what I was trying to say is, some of what you're bringing to me I agree with, and it makes a lot of sense, but unfortunately, I've got, you got the baby and the bathwater all mixed in here, so.
Go look and talk to the city about what they have had to do to try and get the water tower at the south end at Randolph and fighting the Air Force, because they had a whole bunch of ideas on where the Air Force did not want it.
Commissioner Ray, any comments?
Not at this time.
I have a question and some comments. First off, on my handout goes from page 1 to page 3. Are we missing something? And the attachment as well goes from page 1 to page 3. Am I missing something, or is it just an improper numbering? You want?
So it should be a two-sided with page 2 on the back.
Mine's not.
It's blank on the back.
Oh, no.
Here's the back.
Okay, a comment.
Okay.
Or some comments. When it comes to utilities, water, wastewater, electricity, unlike a commercial piece of property, you don't get to pick where these things go. It's determined mostly by geography and the lay of the land. So you can choose to put a water tank in a low spot, but you could double or triple the cost of that facility, and also double and triple and quadruple the cost of running and maintaining that facility. So when you're looking for locations for these things, you don't have the freedom to choose wherever you want. You're limited by geography and the property that's available. So some of these things, I probably wasn't around when most of the Most of the examples we looked at in here were built, but they were built where they were built for a certain reason. It was to keep the cost down, it was to make the maintenance affordable, and it was to make the operation affordable. So I'm not saying I disagree with trying to make them fit into the environment better. We probably could, but there's a tremendous cost to those kinds of things. And when we spend taxpayer money, and I can build a water tank for $1 million, or I can build a pretty one for $1.5 million, how do we justify that extra $500,000? So those are some of the things I think we need to look at and consider. And there should be an avenue to request waivers to all these requirements when it comes to public utilities, because it's a trade-off between how much bang for the buck do we get for a certain amount of money, being taxpayer money, and bonds, and impact fees, and so on and so forth. How do we get the best bang for the buck? So we need to be sensitive to those things, but also try to incorporate some aesthetics into the projects. I don't disagree with that, and I think on the south plant that CCMA is going to build, there's a lot of work being done on making that plant as invisible as possible. So utility companies do look at those kinds of things and those aesthetics. It's just not always an option all the time. So we need some way to put waivers in there or put exemptions, just outright exemptions. And on my previous question, am I missing a page where it talks about fences or not? Or
You are. So I'm going to show it on the doc cam right now.
and there's
It's on the back.
I'll just throw something else out about fences. And last meeting we were talking about barbed wire fences. One, I think it's a security thing. We're seeing across the country attacks and sabotage and other things on public utilities, and I think any type of security that you can put on these facilities, we need to do that. And my problem specifically with an opaque fence like this is you can't see what's going on behind there. So somebody can shimmy over the fence, and they can walk over with a bottle of poison or whatever they want, and they can put it into this water system, and nobody will know until it's too late. I like to have chain link fences or some kind of fence you can see through, because it's a security issue in my mind. I want to know what's going on back there. I don't want people hiding back there or sleeping back there or doing whatever people do when they're behind a solid fence. So that's my input.
So this is the a couple of the sections that was included with your staff packet at the last meeting, was intended to be included with this current one. And it looks like it was two-sided and it didn't print out the backside. So the landscaping portion that we have been discussing has to do with, if you look at the continuation of the bottom of page 1, the landscaping requirement, it's the portion that talks about landscape buffer requirements for non-residential uses. So the proposed amendment, it's the same as what was presented at the last meeting, which is to exempt public water and wastewater facilities from the landscape buffer requirements that require the trees and shrubs planted within the buffer area. And the exemption to the trees and shrub planting would apply for public water and wastewater facilities when an 8-foot masonry fence is provided at or near the project boundary. So that's the proposed amendment. The other portions, and I'll have to move it up here, the other portions that are proposed to be modified has to do with the parking area landscaping. Similar to what was modified for public schools, we're proposing to exempt public water and wastewater facilities from the parking area landscaping requirements and that has to do with the way the sites operate. Typically, landscaping within the parking area, that's something that we'll see for commercial development, and in the event of public water and wastewater facilities, the parking areas are typically not a high count, and if it's enclosed within an opaque fencing, it doesn't make sense to have landscaping requirements when it's screened with the opaque fence. And then for the fencing for non-residential and multifamily areas, we're proposing a modification to the fencing requirements so that public water and wastewater facilities are exempt from the fencing requirements to allow for opaque fencing for these facilities. And then lastly, for the barbed wire fencing, currently our barbed wire fencing provisions about that, it's only allowed for properties when they're keeping livestock on the site, and so we're proposing that that be modified to allow for barbed wire fencing for public water and wastewater facilities, so long as the fencing, it's not visible from public rights-of-way.
So going back to that water tank there off of Encinic Hills.
Okay.
Go back to that image. So can you look at the aerial view of that? So the back wall along the drainage area, they would be able to put barbed wire across the top, but on the other two sides, no.
Well, I believe if you were to continue on Morning Drive, that would still be visible. So because it's visible from a public right-of-way, the barbed wire fencing would not be allowed.
Okay.
So right here, so Morning Drive continues, I don't know how much further, but just myself driving down that subdivision in the past, I know that you could see this back portion of, this back portion of the tank site. And so when you're driving on Morning Drive towards Country Club Boulevard, and so for that reason, if we were to amend the UDC to allow for the barbed wire fencing, it would still not be allowed for this particular site because that back fence is visible from Morning Drive.
You know, maybe it's just me because I live on acreage and I have cattle I got to keep in with barbed wire, but I don't have a problem with seeing it. I don't think it would be appropriate to have barbed wire facing the right-of-way, but if it was visible but not directly facing the public right-of-way, like this back fence line, I personally wouldn't have a problem with it if it would help with the security of the facility.
I think there's got to be a better way to make it aesthetically pleasing instead of making it look like we're in a police state with barbed wire all over the place. There's got to be ways to build a wall where, you know, it can't be egressed as easy as they are today.
And to clarify, that's the barbed wire fencing that's on top of the fencing. It's the razor wire.
And that's not really what you're addressing here is the standard 2 or 3 strand barbed wire fence in lieu of chain link or
No,
slats or something.
no.
No, we're talking, I'm sorry, I don't read it that way.
Yeah, I see barbed wire, read barbed wire as a single strand, and if you're talking about, you know, razor wire or Constantine wire, then, you know, that's a different terminology.
I don't think we're talking about concertina wire. What we're talking about is a 6 or 8 foot chain link fence with 3 or 4 strands of barbed wire on top for security reasons. That's different than what you have, Mr. Dolly, at your ranch. It's not to keep, you wouldn't use that to keep livestock in or out.
No.
You'd use a 2 or 3 or 4 strand barbed wire ranching fence. What I'm talking about, and I don't think the UDC doesn't permit it, is a chain link fence of whatever height you want with the security barbed wire on top. That's what I'm addressing, and that's what I'm saying we need to allow in these utility areas for security purposes. It's not concertina wire. It's not razor wire. So we need I think we need some way to address and include chain link fence with security wires on top, not a rancher's fence. And I don't know what the proper term for that is.
That's why I think just at the end of the day, we need to have the ability to assess this on a case-by-case basis.
So our current proposed amendment for the fencing to allow for the barbed wire fencing is to exempt the public water and wastewater facilities from what is currently listed as a prohibited material, so that the chain link so that the barbed wire that currently is prohibited would be allowed for these facilities. So as Commissioner Bro was saying, the fencing with the barbed wire on top, that is currently not permitted for these public water and wastewater facilities. And so what staff has had to do, because it's not allowed, is we in the past have had to present these to the Board of Adjustment as a variance. And so this proposed amendment would allow for the barbed wire fencing for these facilities so that we would not have to continually process variances for something that's typically required for TCEQ requirements.
Is the number of security issues so great that we need to make a blanket statement in the UDC to allow for it in all cases?
Well, it's a TCEQ requirement, and so our current code is in conflict with that TCEQ requirement. And so the proposed amendment is to enable the barbed wire fencing. That is one of the requirements for TCEQ.
As I said the first time we discussed this, the devil's in the detail. I will apologize. I looked at this as an entirely different. I looked at this as the tongue-tied here, the typical three-strand barbed wire fence that you find around rural property like Mr. Dalla's. It never occurred to me that, because when you say barbed wire fence, that's what pops into my mind is 3 strands of barbed wire, 6 feet, 4 or 5 feet tall, not 3 strands or 2 strands of barbed wire on top of a chain link fence. To me, that's something entirely different. If what you mean here is the security wire on top of the chain link fence, see, I'm okay with something like that, but I didn't get that from reading your description here. I'm sorry.
Right. And the 3-strand that you had mentioned, similar to what Mr. Dalla has on his property, would actually not even be something that would be incorporated into the design of these facilities, because it wouldn't comply with the TCEQ requirements for the height requirements for the fencing.
Outside the requirement of TCEQ, it's like fighting the Air Force and TCEQ and everybody else. Everybody in the world's got a different set of rules.
All right, well, I guess looking back on the landscaping, I think we kind of are at a consensus about not having an issue with requiring landscaping inside the opaque fencing. And then, there hasn't been much comment on the parking area landscaping. And again, from my part, having a piece of property surrounded by an opaque fence, I don't see a need to require landscaping around it, 1 or 2 parking spaces. So I would hope that we can get a general consensus on that idea as well. And so maybe we look at, separating these 2 issues, the landscaping requirement and maybe the fencing, and bring back at the next meeting, the TCEQ requirements on fencing, so we have something to see what we need to look at to be in compliance with their requirements as well.
And I did want to mention one other item. Earlier, I had mentioned that we have 2 applications, one for another tower off of Ray Corbett Drive. And for that one, the proposed site plan, it is the city's intent to incorporate some tree planting along where Ray Corbett would be extended. And so the proposed amendments for the landscape buffer, it would be more for the portions of the lot that the plans are to include fencecrete along the perimeter, and so the proposed landscape buffer language for that would be to not have the trees and shrubs planted on the portions of the site that are adjacent to residential, but the intent is to have the trees planted along the frontage where Ray Corbett would be extended.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we forward ZC 2018-002 to the City Council with a recommendation for disapproval.
All right, I have a motion from Commissioner Outlaw for disapproval.
Second.
All right, have a second from Commissioner Bacon. Any other comments?
I have a question for staff. Where does electrical utility fall into this UDC?
It is under 21.15.4, the utility section. I can show that on the doc cam as well.
Because what I'm thinking of is, I know some folks have asked why there's no screening of the
substations.
I don't know what you call it, the substation at Crossvine. It sticks out a lot, and it's right next to the highway. And the word I got back was, whoever owns that, I don't know if it's SAW or GVEC. CPS? CPS was vehemently opposed to it, and they said, no, we're not doing any screening on that substation. So I'm just wondering where they fit in. We've been talking about water and wastewater. I haven't heard anything about electrical utilities and where they fall. Do they have to follow all these guidelines? And if they do, then they haven't done it at Crossvine.
I think what Commissioner Bro is referring to is it maybe not a true substation, but maybe like a transformer, where they're stepping down. There's an area along 1518 right alongside the high pressure gas line that transverses the subdivision, where there's probably, I don't know, 30 or 40 poles up in the air, a number of transformers, and a number of heavy electrical pieces of electrical equipment out there. And it is somewhat of an eyesore. I would agree with that comment, but. Yeah, and I know the residents, there's another smaller setup where along Lower Seguin Road, where the Sedona development was, where the residents there approached CPS a number of times to ask them to do something about it, and they were rebuffed there as well.
Another question. By recommending disapproval of this, what does it actually do? It freezes the UDC as it is, or we come back? What does disapproving this do?
I believe we would still go to City Council. And with the recommendation, if the motion carries with the vote, then it would be presented to City Council still, but with a disapproval vote. And we would indicate that in the staff report, that the recommendation was for disapproval.
And, to go back to Mr. Outlaw's comments, I don't know that disapproval is necessary. I think that this still needs some more work. I think there's some things in there that we kind of have a consensus on that are probably appropriate, referring back to the landscaping. I think this is probably something that we just need to talk about a little bit more and try to work out, where we have some discomfort, and try to move forward with something that we can recommend to council on. So my thoughts would be that we try to continue to work on it. But we have a motion and a second. Any other comments?
Well, Mr. Chairman, the reason for my motion is a lot of the comments, a lot of the discussion that we had this evening is identical to the discussion we had 2 weeks ago when staff first brought this to us. And they had the opportunity at that time to amend, withdraw, change, do whatever. You know, they heard all those comments last time, and they chose to bring it back to us unchanged. And so at this point, I just think it's, you know, we've made our feelings noted, and I just think it's time to kick this upstairs and let council decide what to do with it.
Any other comments? All right, we have
I do have a comment. What we're supposed to do is, if let's assume that this fails, and what we vote on is to recommend to City Council they disapprove this. It has to include, our document to City Council must include specific reasons why we recommend disapproval. We can't just say, we disapproved it. It has to contain specific reasons. So the minutes of our meeting must be forwarded to City Council with specific reasons for the recommendation for disapproval.
And I would ask that each commissioner, if you vote for disapproval, that you would also state your specific reason as to why when you cast your vote. So, any other comments?
If I could.
Ms. Woodley.
I would just like to point out that if this is not approved, then we will be constructing the Corbett elevated tank site with a ground storage tank and a lift station along I-10 for the Woman Hollering Trunk Main project, and future lift stations with landscaping inside an 8-foot fence. That landscaping will need to be irrigated and maintained by city staff, which does not typically necessarily even travel to those locations on any sort of a regular basis. There's not an opportunity right now for any sort of waiver to those requirements, and there's not necessarily an avenue for a variance for those, because the variance needs to prove a hardship that cannot be financially based. We do have these two projects right now that are in design that are getting close to needing to go out for bid. So that's what we'd be looking at, the possible ramification of not being approved.
Well, if it's disapproved, as the motion has been made, then staff needs to come back with the right recommendations. And that's what y'all still have time to do.
Well, if it's disapproved, then staff can't come back.
Yes, they can, because it's got to go to City Council. They can recommend to City Council to table it or delay action on it until P&Z has heard it again. And when you talk about there are no methodologies of waiver, city staff can write a methodology into this document for waivers. If we are unclear on barbed wire fences, city staff can write into this proposed document what the clarification is. So what we've done is brought back a blanket waiver to everything. And we've heard 2 weeks worth of discussion. There are ways to resolve that discussion that's been had by this commission on the city's part, by the city bringing some things in that make it different. And I'm not talking about major things that take y'all 4 or 5 weeks to figure out.
So I will say this, I wasn't at the last discussion, but I've listened to this discussion, and I really haven't, and please don't take this wrong, but I really haven't heard a real consensus from the Planning and Zoning Commission. I hear a couple people here, a couple people there, and so I think maybe we need a little bit more direction from you guys. Maybe help us out, and maybe can we talk through the issues and start making some notes so that we can go back and make changes? Because I think we have a couple people that seem to be comfortable with some of the things, and then some people who aren't. And so I think that at this point, I think if we could kind of come to a consensus, maybe, I think we could actually bring something forward. But at this point, I'm not sure that we have on the commission. So
Mr. Chairman, may I address that?
Please.
You're absolutely correct, Lisa. There are, I agree with 75, 80% of what you've put in here. As I've said, the idea of having a landscape inside a walled-off facility really doesn't make any sense. I still might argue with you about interior landscaping of parking areas, but that's kind of, my primary objection to what's here is the blanket exemption to the tree mitigation section of the UDC. And maybe I'm, Mr. Chairman, I will withdraw my motion if staff, what did you say I can't?
The motion has been made, it has been seconded, it's on the table, it must be dealt with.
Is that right?
Yes, we do.
I hear council, but I hear them withdraw motions all the time. Okay, I made that motion because, as I said earlier, this is the second time this has been brought to us with no changes whatsoever. Now I'm hearing that maybe staff is a little, is amenable to going back and taking some of this and redoing this and maybe taking some of the objectionable material out.
I think for me, what I just told Shannon is I think we probably would be a good idea to go item by item and talk through each item. I think we kind of have been going randomly through maybe each item and get a consensus from y'all on each one of them. Because, and I'm just speaking from, I wasn't at the last meeting, but I don't feel like there's clear direction. And so I know that y'all are expecting us to go back and make changes, but I'm not sure we know exactly what you're looking for.
I would agree with that, but we do have the motion that we do have to dispose of, and again, I would like to continue the conversation instead of making a recommendation to disapprove. But we do need to have a vote on this, so, if the commission has thought this over in the subsequent comments that, maybe we can continue this conversation, then I believe we would need nay votes to allow this motion to die, and then we can ask staff to bring it back to us in a couple weeks. So, or we can vote yay and go ahead and forward that recommendation. So, any other comments? All right, we'll call for a vote.
I'm sorry, it would help to have that missing page also.
It would.
So, and I'm sorry, so we are voting to take this motion off the table, basically?
If we wish to not make the recommendation for denial to council, then we would need to vote nay. And then we can come back and ask staff, we can address point by point, give staff some marching orders, and come back with something in the next meeting.
Okay, nay.
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 Nay. All right, motion is passed, or has not passed by a vote of 7-0. Okay, we have the motion disposed of. I guess let's go back, look at landscaping, and let's touch on the landscaping issues and see where we can come to some consensus on, and give staff the ability to come up with some language.
Mr. Chairman, would it be appropriate perhaps to have 3 or so of our folks sit down and meet with city staff and go through some of the differences that would make this document amenable and workable, and let the 3 sit with city staff and work on the provisions, maybe it's a wording issue in some cases, and see if that can be worked out and brought back rather than use the entire commission to try to drive home those points, because we got two or three that are in pretty good sync with each other.
Certainly, that's appropriate. We do have the ability to form subcommittees, as long as we don't form a quorum. That certainly is one way to try to address this and move forward. Is there, the will to do that, to take the time to sit down with staff and work this out? If this is the way we want to go, who would volunteer to do that?
Just quickly, I mean, is there a concern that this is going to take up too much time? Is that why we want to?
I don't think with all seven of us sitting here, you will reach a consensus.
But we have to eventually reach the consensus with everybody if we're going to.
I understand that,
So
but
I guess that's
think
why it was.
three people in this room can sit with you folks and bring this to a position that will make that seven come to consensus.
So Commissioner Bacon has raised her hand. Is there? All right, Mr. Greenwald, that's two.
Well, my only concern, Mr. Chairman, is I mean, I certainly don't mind serving on another subcommittee to iron this out, but it's, what am I trying to say here? I don't know if I can speak for other members of the committee. I think I've sat here and listened to the discussions on both meetings, and I think I have a feeling for what we'd like to see here. So if that's the way I guess I'll step up.
Commissioner Bacon, Commissioner Greenwald, and Commissioner Outlaw have volunteered to meet up with staff to work out the language on this and bring it back to P&Z.
So do you need a motion then to do that? To table this?
Subcommittees is an ad hoc type thing, so no, we don't need a motion for that.
We will table it. You will have to table it.
Yes.
You have to table
Yes.
it again.
Yes, we do have to table the agenda item again. So with the three commissioners volunteering for the subcommittee, is there anything else that we need to discuss on this, or can we go ahead and table it for this evening and conclude the rest of our business?
And Lisa, you folks have the time that you can sit down with us in the near future?
Sir, we will make the time.
Okay.
All right, so do we have a motion to table?
So moved.
Second.
Motion to table by Mr. Outlaw, second by Mr. Greenwald. Any other comments or questions? Call for a vote.
Aye.
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 Aye. All right. Item is tabled until staff can meet with the subcommittee and bring the language back to us. Next item on the agenda, requests and announcements. Request by commissioners to place items on a future P&Z agenda. Anybody have anything? I think we got plenty right now. Announcements by commissioners. City community events attended or continuing education events attended. Anybody? All right. Announcements by city staff.
Okay, so just a reminder, this is just an announcement on the new site plans. No comments, no questions. If you have comments or questions, I'd be happy to talk to you about it after the meeting's adjourned, but no comments up here. So the one site plan application that we received between April 19th and May 4th was for the Wiederstein Ranch, Lot 1, Block 1. It's a proposed 73,330 square foot commercial amusement indoor. So 35, this is the Bussey's property. You can see their drive, their parking, and then the proposed building. That's it.
All right, does anybody have anything else? All right, commissioners, everybody, thank you for a very good discussion this evening. I'm glad that everybody participated and everybody felt free to speak their minds and that's how we're going to make this city better. And again, I appreciate everybody's time and willingness to continue to serve both at our regular meetings and on the subcommittees. And with that said, meeting adjourned at 7:45.
I have a pen up here.
She gone?
That's Lisa. Mhm.
Well, the one thing is on that particular one, that